And today I'd like to speak to you about the treasures of the valley. You may be seated. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the people of God sing His praise all over the land. Everyone in the valley, come and lift your voice. All those on the mountaintop, be glad and shout for joy. Everyone in the valley, come and lift your voice. It's not easy to lift your voice in the valley, because to lift your voice is a sign of excitement. Lifting your voice requires feeling, emotions, or deafness. That works too. What? I can't hear you. Speak up. Latins are very expressive, as you might know, and they tend to lift the voices as the temperature rises. But I have not heard as rowdy and noisy a people as the Chinese from the mainland. It seems like they're shouting all the time and fighting all the time. I remember in Taiwan, in the airport, an invasion of Chinese from the mainland a while when they were coming for vacations to Taiwan. A time of impasse of relations over the straits. And they were shouting. I said, what's going on? And later they told me, no, that's normal. That's just the way they talk. And yes, we tend to lift our voice when we're far, when we're mad. But in the valley, we tend to be silent. The mountaintops is where we shout, as the song says. But the valleys is where we encounter a different reality, the reality of the valley. And yet, I think if I could give a title for this message, it would be The Treasures of the Valley. That is where the real treasures lie. That is where God indeed dwells with man. As David inquired, will God indeed dwell with man? And Solomon built a temple. And God was there. And for us, God dwells in the mountaintop. God dwells in church. God dwells when we gather and our faith is inspired and we sing and perhaps even can forget the troubles of the valleys. Forget the daily life we live in and say, oh, we can take a break. We can take a breath of fresh heaven oxygen and to say, I've been with God. I've been in the mountaintop. But sadly, I must come down. Till next Sabbath, till next feast day, till next camp or next conference, I'm the lucky one. I get to go in camps and conferences all over the world so many times a year. I wish you could go with me. Next I'll be in France, Spain, and Israel, just a couple of weeks. And it's wonderful. But you know, the valley is where God dwells. We come off the mountain rejoicing and glad. We finished the service last week and the joy and the dancing didn't stop. It reminded me of a song. The lady whose name you might recognize, you millennials might not know who she is, or what My Fair Lady was, or Julie Andrews was, but she sang, I could have danced all night, I could have danced all night, and still have begged for more. I could have spread my wings and done 1,000 things I've never done before. Oh yes. That's what the mountaintop is. You never wanted to stop. And it seemed like Sunday that they could have danced all day. We turned off the lights and still they danced and rejoiced. Reminded me also of Saul, depressed, not knowing what to do with his life, full of troubles. Persecuted by spirits who didn't let him rest. The realities of the weight of the crown that lies heavy on the head. And in his desperation of his life, seemingly without solutions, he went to the prophet Samuel, and we read in 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 5. What can I do? He said, do this, do that, and then come to the mountain of God. And when you come close to the city, there's a garrison, outpost of Philistines, the enemy. And you'll meet a company of prophets. These were the sons of the prophets that were the students of the school of the prophets that Samuel had started in many places. And he says, you'll see them coming down. They'd go up in the morning. They'd go up on the feast days. And they'd meet with God, and there they'd hear God, and there they'd prophesy, there they'd hear what God was going to do. And it says in verse 5, you shall meet a company of prophets, these are the sons of the prophets, coming down from the high place with psaltery and tabret and pipe and harp before them, dancing and singing and rejoicing as you only could do when you've heard God speak. When you've seen the future. When you've seen what God will do. When you've heard His voice that causes our hearts to stir and rejoice. When you are surrounded by the cloud on the mountaintop where He dwells. And your soul leaps for joy. And down they came as depressed Saul watched. The dweller of the valley meets those that visit the mountain. The long face, the happy shining faces, singing and dancing because they've been in the presence of the Lord. Oh, how wonderful it is. How sad it is to have never been to the mountain. As Saul, to never have known the voice of hope, the voice of encouragement, the voice that says, look, it is beautiful in the valley. No, Saul had never been to the mountaintop, never heard the voice of God. He dwelt all the time. He never came to worship. He never climbed to seek. All he did was live in the world of man. A world of depression, a world without hope, a world of trouble, a world of enemies, a world of choices, life-affecting choices, and not a word from heaven to guide him. Most people live in that world, and that world sucks us in. And quickly, even those that dwell in the mountain, even those that the week before can be dancing and rejoicing, find themselves now as if all the vacuum in their lives, all the oxygen has been sucked out. And the realities of life confront them, and they forget that nothing has changed. Yes, but I don't feel what I felt last Sunday. There you go. There you go. He is not a God that dwells in the emotions of man. If not, he'd had to leave every time we feel sad. He'd have to go every time we're mad. He's a God that dwells in the mountains, but lives in the valleys. In Matthew chapter 17, it tells us the story of Jesus taking Peter, James, and John up the mountain. And there in the mountain, the most spectacular thing happened. It says Jesus began to shine, to be transfigured before them. And verse 2 says, his face did shine as the sun, Matthew 17:2. And his clothing, his raiment, was white as light. They believed in him. That's why they left their fishing boats to follow him, because they believed that there was something about this man that looked like any other man. But his words were strangely captivating, had special attracting power. Some of them didn't know who he was, but all he had to say is look at them and say, follow me, turn and walk. And they were compelled by his power of attraction to leave their trade and follow him. And yet the doubts. Who is he? And then the elation when they saw the miracles. What manner of man is this? What words are this that he speaks? They marveled at the breaking of the bread. And then he said, come with me to the mount. And that man that had attracted him suddenly began to shine. And his face shined like the sun. You couldn't look at it. You looked down and his raiment was white as a light. You couldn't look at his face. Yes, in the mountain, he was no longer a man who marveled them. On the mountaintop, he was as God. In the mountaintop, they could not doubt. In the mountaintop, they knew it was real. And then, as in a hologram, or was it real? Another figure materializes. And then another one. And as they shaded their hands from that shining face, they began to talk, and they knew that it was the words of Moses. It was the words of Elijah. Not words they read in the Old Testament, but the living before them. It was like Elijah himself was speaking them. And they said, it's not just a word. It's alive. I hear it. Moses talks to me. Elijah speaks to me. And oh, the reality. In the mountaintop, God's word is so real. His voice is so real. There's no way to doubt when you're on the mountain. It is too real. The feelings are too intense. But then Peter says, this is it. This is the life I've always wanted to live. Let us live on the mountain. When camp was finishing, the kids said, it was so short. And Sarah said, we have one more day. Today is not church Sunday, today is camp. And you all rejoiced one more day. So you can understand the feeling of Peter when he said, Lord, let us make Matthew 17:4 3 tabernacles or tents. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Would you sleep on the floor? We want to stay here and hear them talk. Hear the scriptures come alive. See Moses jump out of Exodus, Deuteronomy. And there, speak to us. To see Elijah come out of the book of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and stand there before us, and we can hear him speak as if we were going back to the future in time. Yes. Oh, to live in the mountaintop. But then these sad words in verse 9. And then they came down from the mountain. And it's strange that Jesus charged them and said, don't tell them until I'm risen again from the dead. I don't know if you've tried, some of you. When you met someone from school, or texted, or went to Facebook, or Instagram, or WhatsApp, and said, let me tell you what a wonderful time we had. But see, they didn't have the wonderful time. They were as Saul, sulking in the darkness, the shadows of the valley. And you might have been so excited and tell them, let me tell you. And one look at their face, and you say, oh, forget it. You won't understand. Yes, how could they understand? Only one that has been in the mountain and heard the reality of God's presence can retain, if for a little while, because we cannot retain feelings. We cannot retain emotions. We can remember having them, but we cannot keep the intensity that we had at that moment in His presence. Because that's who we are. Like the tide of the sea is the ebb and flow of human life. The tide goes out. The ground is dry. The sea creatures try to scuttle back to the waters. And you say, but where are the waters? And what was once fertile is now dry. What was now exciting, now I can feel it. Because humans cannot retain it. A mother can remember the pain of having pain in childbirth, but she cannot re-feel the pain. If she could, she'd never have another child. She can remember having. And we can remember being happy. We can remember wanting to dance. We can remember the joy. We can remember Him speaking. But we cannot remember the feeling that made us say, I surrender my life to you. Yes, because we now come back to the valleys. Mountaintop is synonymous to seeking God. Climbing the mountain is synonymous with seeking God. And the mountaintop is synonymous with meeting God. The Bible has so many mountaintop experiences. The most known perhaps is Moses, who went many times and received not only the voice of God that he could not remember, but the handwriting of Jehovah himself with his finger etching the stone with the 10 Commandments. In Exodus 24:16 it said, and the glory of God, the Lord, abode on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud, and the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into that cloud, went into the mountain, and was there 40 days and 40 nights. Oh, can you imagine? A 40-day camp. I can remember when I was a child, the month-long camp meetings. People used to come from all the country and live in tents. And they'd have a big tent with sawdust. Did anyone ever see that? Did anyone see a picture of that? I was there. Camp meetings that would last for a month. I remember one of those tent meetings, cars, old cars, well they're old now, parked. You had to walk from so far away. And I remember a man, later everyone got to know him, his name was Oral Roberts. I remember the sick for hours standing in line and he praying one by one. The shouts, the healings, the joy. Can you imagine 40 days in the presence of the Lord? But the clock is ticking, the calendar pages are flipping. And the day comes when we must come down off the mountain and face the now memories of the shining face and the radiant clothes. And then the air of this world begins to contaminate us with all the pathogens of sin, with all the toxins in people's texts, with all the toxins in people's words, with all the toxins in the words of Congress, of government, of candidates, of Iran, the threats, the screams, those toxins and pathogens we breathe every day soon plunge us to reality. And we remember where we live, what we must go back to, and what we must face. Why even have a mountaintop? Why even go to the mountaintop? Because it was there, and it is there. When we see the goal, when we see what one day will be, not what is, but what will be. Deuteronomy chapter 34, it was on the mountaintop, in the plains of Moab, in the mountaintop in the mountain of Nebo, the top of Pisgah, Deuteronomy 34:1, that is overviewing, it would be Jericho. And in that mountain the Lord showed him the land from Gilead to Dan, the land of Naphtali, of Ephraim, of Manasseh, of Judah, up to the sea. It was one of those days when you could see to the end of the horizon and beyond. Because a horizon from a mountaintop can be hundreds of miles. Just as you can see from the Carter Dam in a clear day, 3 states, all the way into Tennessee. You can see from so far when you're high. High not on drugs, high on a mountain. And he saw the promised land. And the Lord spoke and said, that land that you see is a land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give this unto your seed. And I've caused thee to see it with your eyes, but you won't go there. Well, I think actually he did. God must have made an exception, because we read in the scripture that Moses did a quick field trip and killed a giant that lived there in the promised land. But we'll just leave that aside. He saw the promised land. Some lands of promises are so far that it won't be in your lifetime. It'll be in the life of your children or your grandchildren. Sometimes the vision is so great that one generation is not long enough to accomplish it. So don't be discouraged if you only make it halfway or a third of the way. Because remember, God is a generational God. To the 3rd and 4th generation is his blessing lasting, and his promises everlasting. So it is on the mountaintop where we can see farther than we could ever see in the valley. It's there where we receive the promise. It is there where God said, I promise you this will be your future. Of course, when we get down to the valley, we quickly forget, and like Moses, we look at the reality and we feel like casting God's word on the floor and said, it can't be. Look at the surroundings. And yet it's true. And Moses had to meekly go back and say, would you please remind me again? And the Lord gave him a second table made with his own hand. And those for safeguarding he put in the ark. So at every time someone came into the presence of the Lord, he could remember the promise. But when you went back into the valley, all you can see is scattered pieces of stone. And you say, it seemed like so beautiful. A tablet when I was up there in the mountaintop, but here in the valley it just looks like scattered stones that don't have a meaning. Yes, that's the way it is. You see so clearly up in the mountain, but in the valley your vision is impaired. The shadows play tricks on you. And it's not until as David, when he was so discouraged because of his enemies, seen the prosperity of his enemies, he said in Psalm 72, my feet almost slipped until I went to the house of the Lord, and there I remembered. There I saw the end of my enemies. And it's when you come into the presence of God, when you come near to that ark where he dwells, when you come As we sang today, and let us worship when you come, but not just stand there because you don't feel the emotions, but just strive because you know he is here, as Richard said. And you believe it. And you cough up all the toxic smoke and allow the pure oxygen of his presence to come into your lungs. It is there that you can see the original tablet, and you can remember what God told you, what God promised you, and it becomes real again. Yes, that place will always be open, but you must be willing to press through your emotions, press through the darkness, press through that veil that was rent at the cross. You must be willing to come, but not just come in church, but press through. Say, I know the God of the mountaintop is here. I don't see him, I don't feel him, I don't sense him, but that doesn't matter, because he's not a God that depends on feelings, sensing, emotions. He is a God of truth. And he says, I am here. Blessed is he that comes to my gates and stands by my doors and listens. Those that strive and allow faith to overcome feelings, desires to overcome emotions, and press through, press through, press through, and literally come, they find a way opens for them. I shall make a way in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, and they shall spring forth. To them that believe, to them that insist, to them that don't give up just because a week has passed. Yes, the mountaintop is a place of vision. April 3rd, 1968 was a very special day. In Memphis, Tennessee. Because it was there in the Mason Temple that a now famous man, Martin Luther King Jr., gave a speech called, I've Been to the Mountaintop. And here's a quote. Martin Luther King said, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. And I might not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The next day he was assassinated. He didn't live to reach it, but he saw it. And again one day, I have a vision. I have a dream. I've been to the mountaintop, and I'm not worrying or fearing any man, because I've seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Yes, mountaintops are where we see reality and truth and can see a long way out the future, the victory that we don't have today, but we know will be ours. On the mountain, we soar like an eagle. We see, as the hymn, great is thy faithfulness, hope for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Yes, it's on the mountain where we see the bright hope that cannot be seen from the valley. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. We're turning all the time, but not him. Thou changest not. We change every moment. Thy compassions, they fail not. And we fail them every other minute. As thou hast been, as thou hast been on the mountaintop, as thou hast been, thou forever, thou forever, thou until the last day of our life will be. Yes, the mountaintop is beautiful. But you know, the mountains cannot sustain life. People love to climb mountains. People like to find God in the mountains. But people live in valleys, not in mountains. Because the mountains are barren. As you climb, you pass the tree line, the forest recedes, and it's all bare. Rock. Nothing. You climb and you climb, you get to the top. But the top of the tallest mountain is bare. Devoid of oxygen. Those that climb the Everest must take their tanks of oxygen with them because it does not sustain life for too long. Man is not meant to live there. Man does not live in the mountain tops. Man lives in the valley. That's where the cities are. That's where the dwellings are. And yet, There are treasures in the valley and victories in the valley. Let me share a few of these. 2 Samuel 8:13, there's a valley, the valley of treasures and victories. It's called 2 Samuel 8:13 and 2 Kings 14:7 and 1 Chronicles 18:12 and 2 Chronicles 20:11. There's a place called the Valley of Salt. And you might not know it, but salt was one of the most priceless commodities in the ancient world. In fact, the word salary is derived from the word salt, because salt was so expensive. And the mining of salt was very heavily regulated. People couldn't go and get salt. And the Romans paid their soldiers with salt. That's why they call it salarium, today's salary. Do you know that actually salad also comes from salt? Because the Romans began putting salt on leafy greens and vegetables. And they called that, came to us as salad. Salted vegetables and leafy greens. But we read it's also the valley of salt. The valley of treasure was also the valley of victories. In 2 Samuel 8:13, David became famous when he returned from smiting the Syrians in the valley of salt, smiting 18,000 men. David, what a victory! The valley of treasures is also the valley of victory. But who can live in the valley of salt? Yes, we'd like to visit it to get some treasures and victory, but who can live there? 2 Kings 14 talks about he slew in the valley of salt 10,000 of Edom and took Selah by war and called that valley Jokthim. First Chronicles 18:12 tells us about Abishai, who slew the Edomites, 18,000. In 2 Chronicles 25:11, Amaziah strengthened himself and went to the valley of salt and smote the children of Seir, 10,000. Yes, there are treasures in the valleys. People don't live in the mountains, they live in the valleys. Do you know there are no valleys in the New Testament? Check your concordance. Google it. There is no valley. The word valley, you'll only find it in a quote from John the Baptist that said, "It is written in Isaiah, saying, the voice of one crying in the desert, every valley shall be filled." But that was a quote from the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the word valley does not exist. That's just a little factoid. The Old Testament is full of valleys. And one of the most used word for valley is a Hebrew word, nashal, which means a stream, a brook, a river. See, because the valley is where the mountaintop snows and springs flow down through the valley on their way to the sea. And in the deep valleys you will always find a creek bed, a place where waters flow. And that's why people like to live in the valleys. In the valley there's creeks, there's rivers, there's trees, there's life, there's forest, there's cattle. The valley is alive with the sound of music The hills are alive. Yes. The hills and vales of the valley are alive with teeming with life, with cities. In Psalm 23, David said, the Lord's my shepherd, shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. That's not in the mountain. That is in the valleys, in the vales. King Solomon in Song of Solomon 6:11 talks about the fruits of the valley. That's where the vine flourishes, the pomegranates budded. That's where there's nuts, the garden of nuts, and there's so many nuts in the valley, especially in the city. It's full of nuts. That have never heard of the mountaintop, don't care about the mountaintop, they're just full of nuts, all kinds of nuts. We'll just leave it there. Leave it to your imagination. Do you know, beautiful for situation. What's beautiful for situation? Remember camp? Mount Zion, the city of our God. Jerusalem is in a valley. You've been there, you said, but Jerusalem isn't a mountain. No, no, no. It's called a valley. Isaiah says the valley of vision. It's called a valley because there's mountains surrounding Jerusalem that are higher than Jerusalem. So compared to those mountains you come down to, you have to come down and then you can go up a little bit to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is a valley. And there are several valleys within the city between Mount Zion and Moriah. Cal, you walked in that valley and then had to walk back up to the house of Ruth. It's surrounded by mountains. Beautiful for situation. Mountains cannot sustain life. Mountains are for a short visit. We're not meant to be mountain people. And Jesus said it clearly in his prayer, Father, I don't pray that you take them away from this place. But they're not from this place. They're not from the world. This is not their world. But keep them here in this valley. Yes, the valley is where we're meant to live, but the mountain is where we're meant to be. And Jesus, every evening, after the noises and screams and produce and commerce of the city died down and the sun went down, he would leave his disciples sometimes sleeping. He'd walk out and go up the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane, his famous place where he loved to be, and sit under his olive tree and commune with God. He lived in the valley during the day, but always found a moment to find again, to renew his fellowship, to find north again in his compass, to put things again in the right place. See, if we don't do that the next day, we won't know what to do. When Jesus arose the next day, refreshed from his mountaintop communion with the Father, he came with instructions. Heal this man. Don't answer that man. See, if we want to live the mountain life on earth, we have to maintain that connection. Remember that. Apart from me, you can do nothing, remember. You'll dry up. We are to live in the mountain inside, even though outside we dwell in the valley. Sometimes the valleys are not lush and green. Sometimes in our life, they're not green pastures. They're not still waters. Sometimes our life is thrown into the rapids. And in the same psalm that David said, you lead me to still waters and green grass. Just a few verses after that he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. No, the word here is not the same word as the first one that talks about rivers, springs, creeks. This word for valley is gai, which means a narrow gorge with high walls, cliffs on each side. A perfect place for ambush. A perfect place for archers to perch. Stone throwers to throw. A gauntlet. Many times we must go through gauntlets of pain. Gauntlets of different pressures of life. Gauntlets where there's no way out except go through it. And we're faced with a valley, a gai, that you can't climb out of it. You can't go back in time. You can only go forward, and you don't know what you're going forward to. Yes, many times in life. But that is where David remembered who he was. He remembered the times he was in God's presence in that little tent of the ark. He remembered. And he strengthened himself in the Lord, and he said, I will fear no evil in this deep gorge I must go through, because you are with me. Do you remember that he is with you? Have you remembered this week that he is with you? Do you remember this morning that he is with you? Or have you forgotten because the toxins and pathogens of life have made you to be sick and your mind to wander? Remember and come. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You truly are not alone.